this is study 19 of Galatians, and today we're going to be looking at chapter 5, verse 7 to 12. Before we do, we'll answer the questions from chapter 5, verse 1 to verse 6. Now, just to say some things again, Christ was born under the law, and he was circumcised into it. He obeyed it fully, fulfilled its demands, and then he died the death of a cursed lawbreaker and rose again. Those who trust in Christ then are declared righteous in him and are then free from the bondage of sin and free from the bondage of the law. The Galatians were being told that what Christ had done for them was not enough, that they had to add to his work in some way, that they too had to be circumcised into the law of Moses and obey it in order to be righteous. So Paul says some things about what it means to be circumcised into the law. First of all, it's to be entangled once again into bondage. You can see that in chapter 5, verse 1. You'll also see it again in chapter 4, verse 8 to verse 9, Acts 15, verse 10, and I encourage you to go and read Matthew 11, verse 29 to verse 30. So to be entangled once again into bondage. Second of all, it's to reject the finished work of Christ and attempt to be made righteous by your own works. That's in verse 2. And also go and see chapter 3, verse 16. It's third of all, it's to be indebted to obey the whole law. Chapter 5, verse 3, and also chapter 3, verse 10. And finally, it is to forfeit the grace of God in verse 4, and also chapter 3, verse 21. Now, this is not talking about losing your salvation. This is about seeking to be made righteous by the law instead of being declared righteous by the promise. So then Paul says two things that the believers will do. Number one, they confidently and joyfully anticipate righteousness as the free gift of God in Christ. Joyfully anticipate righteousness as the free gift of God in Christ. And second of all, they lovingly and gladly express the internal work of God through outward actions. God has worked in us, and we express that outwardly. The law was saying we need to work outward works to be made righteous. What the gospel is saying is we are righteous and we work that out. Completely different. Now, these 2 points are just like Galatians 2 verse 20. We are crucified with Christ and risen again with Christ's life in us, which makes us, number one, righteous in the sight of God, and number two, it makes it so that he can work out of us into our daily lives. We've talked about this already in Philippians 1 verse 6 and in chapter 2 verse 12 to 13 of Philippians as well. Now, this is so important. It is saying something very big here. What it's saying is two things. Number one, our justification, that is being declared righteous, is through faith in the finished work of Christ for us. And number two, our sanctification, that is our growing and our living in this righteousness, is through faith in the ongoing work of Christ in us. So justification and sanctification is the work of Christ, not our efforts. So then we begin, we continue, and we finish the Christian life by grace, by faith, by the Spirit. Now we're in verse 7 to 12 of chapter 5, 3 questions. Question 1, what were the Judaizers doing to the truth? In verse 8 and verse 9. Number 2, what were the Judaizers doing to the believers? In verse 7, verse 10, and verse 12. And number 3, what does Paul say will happen and wants to happen to the Judaizers? Verse 10 and verse 12.